Thanks so much, Anne, and welcome everyone. Nice to see those that have rejoined us. You're getting a bit sick of me now, I'm sure, but you've got some very exciting speakers lined up for today. So thank you for giving of your time this afternoon. Today's session is our final session in this seminar, and it is the first part of the session, which I'm going to be introducing now, is about supervising the research design methodology and knowledge creation. All about making informed choices about research design, how do we align our methodology and modes of inquiry, knowledge creation, the different types and ways of doing this. The first session is taken by Professor Ben Anderson, and when you introduce your own colleagues, you don't always use their CVs. So I always say when I introduce Ben, my favorite quote says, "With great power comes great responsibility." And I know many people attribute this to the Spider-Man and Marvel comics, but actually, if you know the true history of this, it was originally in 1793 by Voltaire. And the original quote from the French Revolution spoke about they must consider that great responsibility follows inseparably from great power. And I use this quote purposely because I think Prof Anderson really is someone who takes the research journey and doctoral supervision to the next level in terms of responsibility. For him as a supervisor and as somebody who is an astute academic, he really gets students onto a different trajectory, a different journey, gets them to think differently and to actually really embrace this journey. And I think from my own personal experience, one of the things that Ben does, which I appreciated, was he makes people think about things that they haven't thought about before. So in my own studies, I was right at the end of my own PhD, and I was having a casual chat with Ben one day, and he said, "Well, have you considered this? And I'd like to tease you a little bit about that." And I actually ended up adding a year onto my PhD to make the changes. And I guess what I'm trying to say here is I think it's really important when we have different speakers to take from them what we can in order to grow. And so Prof Anderson will no doubt pique your curiosity and tease a little bit, but the depth and understanding that he will offer to this discussion is someone who really is a lifetime academic. So Prof Anderson, I hand over to you to begin your session. Thank you very much. Sorry, I was a bit impolite. The one thing is, please feel free to pop in the chat section. Please feel free to pop any questions, etc. I will monitor the chat for Prof Anderson. If there's time after his session, we will take some questions, but alternatively, there is a Q&A session at the end where we do engage. Those of you that have been on, you'll know how it works. So please keep the questions, commentary, and conversations coming. Thanks, Prof Ben.
Thank you, Marla. Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks to SABSA. So maybe just by way of introduction, the three components of what I will share today by way of conversation, I would like to articulate as follows. I would want to start off by introducing the discussion on the modes of learning, mode 1, mode 2, mode 3, and I want to add to that typology the notion of the triple helix. So I will talk to mode 1, mode 2, mode 3, and the triple helix. Then I would like to share a bit of my subjective experience and understanding of research design and research methodology and the related methods or modes of inquiry that can be considered. So I want to start off by talking to the reality or the context within which you and I are having this discourse today as academics or industrial specialists or researchers. So either as creators of knowledge or as users of knowledge, we are probably all aware of the shift from the industrial market economy to the creative market network economy. And maybe just for reference, the reality that in the industrial economy, the core ideas was focused around tangible goods, best practices, and standardization of processes. Whereas in the creative economy, it's about intangible services, emerging practices, and transparency in changing or developing work practices. So the core ideas are critical to ask ourselves as a researcher, particularly at the PhD level, but also at the master's level. Where is the mind of the student, of the institution I'm involved with, and where am I in terms of these core ideas? Am I, from a technology point of view, still focused on mass production and centralization and creating factories, or am I thinking of the World Wide Web and mass customization using technology? Am I thinking of organizational models about centralized and fixed models, or am I thinking of decentralized and dynamic models? And in terms of knowledge distribution, typically related to the industrial economy, was at large the business schools. And that's why this was of particular importance for me to raise it here. In the literature, we as business schools, and in particular our MBA programs, are still defined as part of the industrial economic construct. Whereas in the creative economy, the knowledge distribution is preferably and emerging more so through networked professional teams and communities of practice. The business ideology, as we know in the industrial economy, is about the science of management, where there's hierarchies and standardized practices and specialized tasks and policies and jobs and planning control. And that's predominantly what happens outside of me. Whereas in the creative economy, it's about managing complexity and understanding complexity and the necessity to continuously probe, sense, and respond, and engage people by enabling autonomy and mastery and a sense of purpose. So, in this context, we may already be divided as a common or as a collective this afternoon. We may find ourselves in one or the other. We may even bridge, or we may even play sometimes here and sometimes there. Then you see me, then you don't. But I thought I want to hold that mirror up for myself. So when I have the discussion this afternoon, I hope to share that I want to be transparent in explaining that I am intending or try by all means to embrace what the creative economy positions and proposes to us as colleagues from modern day business schools. So that brings me into talking to the construct of mode 1, mode 2, mode 3, and there may be many modes, and maybe in future there will be different modes. And then the notion of the triple helix, particularly talking about the creative economy. Now, I want to start off by saying in the mode 1 context, the nature of the research issues will probably be structured and there will be a well-defined problem and a goal. It will reflect a sense that I know what I must do and that I can take control. From a knowledge perspective, it will often be disciplinary focused. From a relevant actors and relationship point of view, there will often be a central role project team from an established institution, and there will be principal-agent relationships. So the relevant actors and the relations are very structured and almost predefined in the mode 1 construct. From an intervention process, the execution in the mode 1 is often linear, of problem formulation, of planning, of implementing, and of evaluating. And the intervention impact is direct project outputs. Show me, make it tangible. Now, some of us may be, either by our own choice, be part of that mode 1 construct, or we may be operating within that mode 1 construct, but not necessarily being mode 1 in our thinking. Because in the mode 2, the nature of the issues are looked as unstructured and inherently complex. It almost takes the assumption from a mode 2 point, I will not be able to solve this. I've got no intention to solve this problem. I just want to probe it. There is knowledge in terms of the relevant knowledge. It's transdisciplinary and it comes from different scientific fields and disciplines. And important, it's also including experiential knowledge. The unknown, the unwritten, the undefined, the ill-defined knowledge. The actors and the relevant actors and the relations are collaboration, cooperation between different people, people from industry, people from the university, people from the education space, people from the public space, from civil organizations, and important citizens. If we look on the intervention process, it's emergent designs, and it focuses on stimulation of experimentation and often double loop learning between different actors. So we reiterate and we configure in a continuous search to improve understanding. And the outputs in the mode 2, mode 3 space is beyond project level. It's the impact on the system level as well as the individual level. Now, I'm not going to go into a deep discussion around mode 3 other than to say, I will add the last component and say from a mode 3 perspective of knowledge creation, it is indeed about an integrated systemic understanding, also appreciating systemically how the ecosystem is involved from a micro to a meso to an exo and ultimately to a macro level. So against this background, colleagues, science in the mode 1 tradition or construct speaks to society as an imperative. Whilst in the mode 2 and 3 and the triple helix framework, society now speaks back to science. So there's almost a reverse communication regarding the role of knowledge production in society within the mode 2, mode 3 triple helix context. And what I sense is the emergence of an increasingly opening and a shifting of boundaries that's happening because of the boundaries becoming more open as we move along, where knowledge production is taking place in the context of application and it's being organized around a particular useful purpose. This contextualization of knowledge is also invariably talks to the institutional structure of our education institutions, hence old school scientists engaging with knowledge producers and users outside of the education institution. So I want to conclude for a moment or just take a point of reflection and therefore say maybe the idea of a useful purpose is a critical piece. And if we look in the literature of mode 2 and 3, and I'm not going to explore or expand a lot on it or elaborate on it this afternoon, the notion of sustainability always emerges somewhere. And maybe I just want to share a note here on that. The idea of sustainability already emerged in 1987 when Brundtland said, sustainable development should be meeting the needs of the present without harming the ability of future generations to meet their own development needs. Okay, so that may in some way derail us a bit, but I thought I just want to share the idea of the sustainability construct in talking about it, but predominantly focus on the idea we are researchers. We're journeying with masters and PhDs. And my question is, to what extent do we align or do we even articulate in this knowledge production process the idea of purposeful or useful purpose? Noluthando, what do you think? Noluthando with us? Betty, let's go with where Betty is. Betty Mapala.
Yes, Prof.
There's Noluthando.
I'm sorry, I was actually muted.
Thanks, Noluthando.
I think now that you are raising it, I just want to be honest and say, in some instances, with me supervising students, particularly on the area knowledge of governance, there will be few that would be actually very much concerned about sustainability. I think we still need to do more to encourage our not only our students, even our colleagues that we are actually collaborating with to actually to focus more on sustainability, especially now that we're talking about shortages of energies and also challenges related to also water shortages. So we have to know that sustainability is actually a key towards addressing this limitedness of these resources. Because if it was actually considered even before we were even born, we wouldn't be having this problem of shortages of natural resources. Thank you very much.
Beautiful. And you know, that echoes the statement made by the European Business School Association that the critical factor that we should all focus on as business school colleagues is sustainability, and particular as relates to climate matters, to your point of the natural resources and the depletion of those resources. So yes, whatever I do research on, do we get that useful purpose? And maybe sustainability could be one of such a useful purpose. Devout, see your hands up?
Yes, Professor. I'm from Da Vinci Business School. So I've served under you. I would, first of all, mode 3 thinking has blown me away. I've never thought of it like this in the triple helix. The second thing is perhaps you can speak to hyper-individuality, which seems to be what is happening more and more today in our society. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Devout. Any other comments on useful purpose? So to the question, and I'm not going to talk into detail, we can talk offline on it more, that the construct of hyper-individuality is almost for me a natural consequence, or it should be a natural consequence of all the engagements that we as individuals have had as knowledge workers over the past few million years. I'm always thinking, why did the construct and the reality and the emergence of hyper-individuality not emerge many moons ago? Partially, I think that how the creation of knowledge and the power related to the creation of knowledge was institutionalized by many actors, governments, church, just to mention two, have probably played a role in not allowing even the basic notion of individuality to emerge. But today, we are at least having the conversation, and we are appreciating that there is power in the diversity and the heterogeneous perspective of individuals, which are feeders towards the promotion of a highly individualized society, and what every individual's contribution can be towards probing reality and making sense out of reality. So, but that's a big discussion to have. You know, the other day I was in a discourse or presentation and reminded myself on the work of Bruno. Now, Bruno was so individualized by the 15th century that he could actually say that there are not one sun and one universe, but that there are multiple suns with multiple universes. But because of that highly individualized comment, and he was not able to show it scientifically yet, well, the church burnt him at the stake and said, we are not going to listen to you because this may be dangerous. So the conflict of being highly individualized, developed, is something that is hopefully moving in a different direction than in the 1500s. But I would still hope to see much more movement in that regard. So let me just go a little bit more into the mode 2, mode 3 idea, because I sense that mode 2 and 3 as a sense-making methodology will promote the deinstitutionalization of knowledge. Inevitably, it will promote the deinstitutionalization of knowledge. Whilst at the same time, the triple helix framework of a relationship between education, industry, and government will challenge, in particular, the education institutions to become contributors to socioeconomic development. That's the one piece, and we are experiencing at business schools very much. But secondly, it will also emerge that each of these helixes, education, industry, and government, will start to take on more roles of other helixes. We are not, as education institutions, the only providers of education anymore. We know the corporate university construct. We know the corporate academies. There are many derivatives of that emerging. Similarly, we know that the industry is not just the producer of new products, but that it can also provide, as I now said, education. But even the university or the education institution can start providing development and commercialization of products. And so is government not the only one, as the regulating entity, often making the policies, but that it is informed from the other helixes. So I believe if we as business school supervisors, with masters in particular PhDs, could consider if at least components of a mode 3, mode 2 and 3 framework and components of the triple helix model in our supervision of probing problems with students. I wonder what will that do to the depth of knowledge that will be created. So I work on policies for employment equity, or I work on marketing strategies for banking. Why do I often as examiner only read the perspective of banking? I look for the transdisciplinary engagement. I look for the diverse perspectives, you know, in terms of what other controls are there in other industries. I look for the heterogeneous understanding from different minds around that construct. And I sincerely miss the social impact or relevance. So maybe I must ask, is it worth our while to consider these dimensions related to Mode 2 and 3 and the triple helix in our supervision practices? Charles? Dr. Adiola?
Good afternoon, sir. I've been following your discussion about, can you hear me? Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right. I do.
Yes, I hear you,
appreciate-
Adiola.
All right.
Yes,
I just wanted to make a comment about the need for multidisciplinary approach, more so when we are doing our research and we focus on only one line. Most of the problems of the world are quite complex. As such, we may not be able to solve it looking at it in one particular focus. So the issue of being multidisciplinary is quite critical at this stage to ensure that in terms of preferring solutions, we're able to bring in different angles to be able to get something tangible. More so when we're looking at the complexity of our problems, particularly I'm speaking from the angle of supply chain and transportation. Thank you.
And I wonder, Adiola, how easy is it for you as a supervisor to create a round table with people thinking differently and bring them to your students' journey? And how easily do we do that to address the matter that you're raising now?
I will be the first to say that most of the time, because of the pressures that students encounter, it's not really that quite straightforward. It's not that straightforward to get everybody to look at it in that approach. Yes, I will be honest, because you find out that there are several pressures, but I'm even looking at it from the angle of the student looking from the angle of the students individually, not even in a round table perspective. Thank you.
So I wonder, Anne, if we said, will business schools embrace a more holistic approach towards supervision and ensuring more useful purpose in the outcome, as opposed to producing outcome in large numbers? What will your view be, Anne?
Putting me on the spot, Prof. I think that from SABSA's perspective, as you know, when we did this workshop, we are looking for quality and quantity. We want to try and relate everything together. And we are using our collaborative nature to build excellence in graduate education. So we're relying on you professors to all talk together and hold each other accountable and share knowledge. So from our side, we are not.
But I do think we get sucked into an institutional paradigm that in some way takes us away from a useful purpose, or could take us away from a useful purpose.
Sure, absolutely. And I think it all depends on how your institution, what your culture is and where you're going with everything. I was in another chat to one of our business schools today, and the comment was that the volume of students is so large that they're looking at actually digitalizing the whole supervision process. I'm talking specifically about that because they cannot follow up with each and every single person, and some are quite lazy and they don't want to do, every single technical thing, but useful purpose, that's up to your institution and you as peer professors and academics to work that out.
And I think you just hint to something which I would love for SABSA to consider. I think AI is going to give us a helping hand in this regard. We just don't exactly know how to work it out, but it will be. I think we can give it another round and we will be able to do more in less time. I think we just haven't worked it out. So thanks, Anne, for that contribution. I want to close off this part because I'm aware of the time and say complex structured problems cannot be solved by interventions based on single disciplinary knowledge or expertise. And we all know this, I'm talking to the converted, but we all know they require cooperative engagements, or I believe they require cooperative engagements with actors from diverse backgrounds, both at individual and institutional level. Complex problems also require strategies that entail agile reviews of existing patterns of action, as well as in the structures in which they take place. And I hope our consideration of different modes of knowledge creation can assist us in dealing with this complexity towards useful purpose. So concluding on that, I want to go to the next part, which is talking about research design. And I want to say, so on the research design, there are different angles from which we could look at this. My notion of research design as for the last 20 years or 15 years have been very much informed by the work of Babi, which describe research design as a logical arrangement, or a master plan specifying the methodologies and procedures for collecting data and analyzing the needed information. It also spells out the type of research, and as we have experienced in the previous days, research paradigm, research theory, sampling methods, sources of data, procedures for data collection, measurement issues, and data analysis plans. A good research design, I believe, is important as to produce a quality research report and quality research report. So when we talk about research design, it's such a rich and mixed construct. Because I sense that we mix design and methodology and method and mode of inquiry very easily. It almost very easily gets into a mix, and then you can't see the wood from the trees. So I for myself, in my experience since doing supervision in the early 90s, had to craft for me my understanding of research design. And there may be multiple understandings, but it gave me a handle that I can navigate myself in my supervision practice with particularly PhD students, but also with the master students, because they are often and of late the ones who really struggle, being almost the late graduates from universities on understanding these course constructs. So let me start off. If I look at the plan of the research design, before I get to the types of research design, I think there are specific steps. The first one is, have I actually captured how I will assess relevant existing knowledge on the phenomenon? Have I articulate how I'm going to assess that? Have the student and I formalized the concepts and the propositions that will form the core of this research study? Have I articulated my idea for what the research is about, or the hypothesis or hypotheses? Have that been crafted as part of my research design? And have I designed, have I selected a research methodology with accompanying methods or modes of inquiry to test my ideas and hypotheses? So that fourth action step is important for me. Have I selected a specific research methodology with a specific accompanying set of methods or modes of inquiry to test my ideas, if it's qualitatively, or hypotheses, if it's quantitatively? Do I know what is my activities to acquire meaningful data? And as a sixth step, is there an analysis and an evaluation of the data? And the last step, is there a proposal for an explanation of the phenomenon and a statement of new problems raised by the research? So those 7 steps have formed, if you wish to, a conceptual or a meta construct, which is important in me guiding and supervising a student through their research journey. And having said that about the 7 steps, I'm also very aware that the research design needs to indicate the type of research intended to be undertaken. And the type of research is in broad for me defined, whether it is exploratory, descriptive, or explanatory. So integrating the research typology, the design typology of being exploratory or descriptive or explanatory into the research design, I believe will be important right from the start. And maybe just to give a short, my own interpretation of these, because there may be different ones. Exploratory to me is conducted in new areas of inquiry to scope out the magnitude or the extent of a particular phenomenon or a problem or behaviors. The descriptive research examines the what, the where, and the when of phenomenon, and it's directed often by making careful observations, giving detailed documentation on a phenomenon of interest, and these observations are based often, maybe not always, but often on the scientific method, which means the research must be applicable and precise, which leads to the conclusion that it should be more reliable than causal observations. So this research design, as with exploratory, has got a very specific parameter set to it. Then the explanatory design seeks explanations of observed phenomena and problems or behaviors, and seeks answers to questions as to why and how. It therefore attempts to connect the dots by establishing causal relationships between variables and identifying causal factors and outcomes of the targeted phenomena. And I often wonder if there's an oversight from us on articulating these design typologies of exploratory, descriptive, or explanatory. And whether we even think, or whether some of our colleagues even think, that that should form part of the research design. Let's get some comments. Dr. Mamohao? Gusamusi? Anyone that wants to comment on that? Elsie Tsolu?
No comment from me for now, Prof. Thanks.
But give me a sense, is this an easy engagement with your students? Crafting this, or working through this typology of exploratory, explanatory, or descriptive? Or is it restrictive?
Sorry, I was muted. I usually find it coming in. It's not very much of an issue a lot of times, if I may put it that way. Yes. Yes.
Okay.
It's not something to put too much energy on quite often. Yes.
Okay. Charlene, I wonder if you can elaborate a bit more, also recording your, your presentation and the richness of it. Any comments on this
Sorry,
so-called
Ria's
design
also got her
typology?
hand up.
Sorry?
Ria's got her hand up as well. Sorry, Rita.
Thanks, Rita. Let's go first with Rita.
I think that is one of the big challenges that we have when we work with students and to supervise them. And I think a student cannot focus he or her studies before they haven't decided what they want to do. And that will determine whether it will be descriptive, explanatory, or exploratory. And the outcome will then inform what they're going to do. And then our responsibility is then to lead them to decide to choose a methodology that would fit that. And that's not an easy way, because they sometimes come in with certain predispositions and ideas, and it's not always an easy road to take.
Yep. That's my experience. To me, this is often a bit of a bottleneck. Because it's almost here where they start gluing the constructs in a coherent way and integrating them or not integrating. Charlene, your view?
Thanks, Ben. Good afternoon, everyone. I cannot agree more with you. For me, a student should understand whether it's exploratory, descriptive, or causal. And not to keep on beating the drum I did yesterday, but for me, that is something that they ought to understand before we get to the more complexities of research. And as Rita said, even though it is hard, one could expect of them to understand this, because if they understand it, design will be so much better, and we won't have students claiming causality when in fact there aren't any causality in their research. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Charlene. Thank you very much. I want to move on to the probably more known aspects of research design. So I'm really just going to talk to the headings of it and saying, if you look at quantitative designs, we all know you can get the true experimental design, you can get the quasi-experimental design, you can get the single subject design, you can get the descriptive design, you can get the comparative design, the correlational design, the survey design, or the ex post facto design. So there are potentially 8 research designs that can be considered from a quantitative perspective. When we get to the qualitative designs, I think there's another layer, because it seems to me that there are 2 main types within qualitative designs, and which is an interactive mode or a non-interactive mode of inquiry in qualitative designs. And if I look at the interactive qualitative design, research designs, we're talking about ethnography, phenomenological designs, case study designs, grounded theory designs. I even of late heard about an art-based designs. Your non-interactive designs are your concept analyses and your historical analyses. But these 6 designs are all related then to potentially qualitative research designs. I don't know if we need to discuss that in more detail, because I think that is, we as supervisors probably know these things because we work with it every day, but I just thought to just at least list, if not all, at least some of them. Now, the question is then, how do I now move from my design to the methodology? And, you know, what do we see as the difference between the two? Now, again, here are many definitions and descriptions, but I think the research design, it seems to me, is the overall strategy and the analytical approach to integrate in a coherent and logical way, I would say, the different components of the study to ensure a thorough investigation. Overall strategy, analytical approach to integrate in a logical, coherent way. Whereas the research methodology that should now lean and strengthen that design are the specific procedures or techniques used to identify, select, process, and analyze the information about a topic. And that obviously relates to the constructs of validity and reliability. Now, in my discussions with colleagues and peers on this, I think we are not necessarily all at idem with the distinction between research design and research methodology. So I would like to, I would almost like to take some questions or comments in this. The one I promote as an overall strategy and approach to integrate in a coherent and logical way the different components, and the other are the specific procedures and techniques to identify, select, and process and analyze information on a topic. Any comments on this? Uzumusi, can we give it a try? I just can't see all the people, Marla. I don't know if there are any hands.
No, no hands at the moment.
Or are we really clear on this, Dion? Are we clear on the difference between the design and the methodology?
Prof Javier's got his hand up there.
Sorry, I can't see Javier.
Javier's got his hand up.
Good.
So just a question, because I quite often get this on this point of design versus method, where students ask me, but where would one look at, or where would one fit in mixed methodology or action research? Is it on the design side? Is it on the method side? So I know we had the discussion, but I think that might also contribute to the discussion here today.
Well, I think that's great that you asked that, because I would say if we look at, and thanks for reminding me, because actually in my notes, if we look on the research methodology, I would say you get quantitative methodologies and qualitative methodologies, and then you get mixed methodologies, which is a combination of field methods, such as observations and interviews, with traditional surveys, for example, as an example of a mixed method. So I would see it as part of the research methodology, because it talks to specific procedures and techniques that will be used to identify and select and process the information from my point of view. I can also add there, you get action research. Yeah. Is also a research methodology for me. And that is specifically selecting, again, specific procedures and techniques in the research to improve practice. And we all know it started by improving educational practice. But it involves, as we know, the action, the evaluation, the reflection, and is based on the gathering of evidence where changes in practice are implemented, because those are those four constructs of observe, reflect, plan, and act. So that's another example of a research methodology.
Dr.
I'll get to that now, Marla. And then the fifth one that I will want to integrate here as another methodology is integral research, which I will describe as an emergent research methodology, where it allows the researcher to choose between 4 or a combination of 2 or more research paths that jointly fulfill three specific criteria: to reflect on different modes of thinking and being; secondly, to acknowledge culture and the relevance thereof to the specific context of which they are applied. And thirdly, leading the research, leading from a burning social issue to transform action on the ground. Now that's an emergent methodology of which many institutions may not even use yet. And there may be others emerging as methodologies. But I think, Harvey, to your point, to close, I think it's whether they have got that specific procedures and techniques engaged as a process, as a methodology versus an overall strategy.
Thank you, Benny.
Sorry, Marla.
So Dr. Tsako has got his hand up. Dr. Tsako?
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Oh, sorry, Dr. Tsako, I didn't see your initial. Apologies. It's
Okay.
Sorry,
All
I
right.
it just said your initial. Apologies.
Okay, no problem. Once I understand the distinction between your qualitative and quantitative research approaches, I just want to check where best could one allocate your systematic and scoping reviews within the two approaches?
That's a good question. So let's think in terms. So you now thinking of so can I ask, maybe first ask, to which type of design will you relate that? Before we get to the methodology, to which type of design will you relate that systems pieces and observations? Is it exploratory, is it descriptive, or is it explanatory? Because if I look at it, it will not necessarily be in the domain of new. Am I correct? Were you aware?
Okay, so I was struggling to unmute. Yes, it won't be in the domain of new.
So it will then probably be in either the domain of what, where, and when, or will it be in the domain of why?
I think it will be in the domain of why and what. I'm just guessing because I'm intending to start a project in this regard where I will be using a different methodological framework. That's why I'm asking all these questions, which is based on Exi and Omeli of 2005. I'll be using exactly that methodology, and also in terms of the reporting, I'll be focusing on Prisma. So that's what I'll be looking at. There's an article that I'm currently busy with.
Okay, so maybe colleagues, please come to the discourse. Charlene, maybe you can come in. My sense is that you're talking more about the what, the where, and maybe the when, as opposed to the why. Are you going to deduct from that research?
Yes, basically, I don't think the when will be an issue, even though the when will be part of the inclusions and exclusions.
Yes.
Because in the methodological framework that will be used, there'll also be an element of inclusions and exclusions.
Mm-hmm.
But basically, I think what is important is the what and the why.
And the way.
Because, yeah, and the way, yes. Yes.
You see, I'm struggling. Help me with the why. Why would you put the why there? Is there a why, do you think? Because I'm almost wondering if you're talking to, do you think this will relate to concept analyses?
Yes, you are correct.
So it's
The
more,
nature of the questions are conceptual and theoretical in nature.
yes.
So-
Yes. So it seems to me, without having all the information, I think it seems to be a non-interactive mode of inquiry.
Yes.
So it will be probably then a qualitative research design, but the methodology could be that of concept analysis as a qualitative research methodology.
Yes, you are correct.
Okay.
Thank you.
I hope that helps.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, and it's reminding me
Ben, sorry,
that we're almost out of time.
Yes, I wanted to say that for me, I think I always look at it, if I look at it simplistically, that research design would be the overall strategy for me. I always say to students, you know, think of it strategically, whereas from the methodology, systemically, how it's a way to help you solve the research problem. So I think, you know, what tools are you going to use to help? Because I think sometimes that helps students, particularly at the master's level. And if they've come off a business honors or postgraduate diploma and haven't done a lot of research, I think that does often help to kind of give the bigger umbrella versus the tools. That's just my own perspective.
Okay, I want to say thank you because I'm going to have an electricity switch over because I'm going on to load shedding and then the other machines must come in. So I think, can we conclude here, Marla, from my side?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you very much.
So thanks, Prof Anderson, much appreciated. And thank you for engaging us. It is 4 o'clock now, so you've spot on, Prof Anderson. And so we will take a 5-minute break, or do you want it 7 and 5? Yeah, so we'll take a 5-minute break just until 4:05 if we can regroup. And then Prof Klopper will engage us on the next topic, and I'll introduce that after the break. Thank you very much, all. All right, so thanks, Anne. The recording has begun. So Prof Klopper is going to wrap up these 4 days by looking at the supervisor models, roles, and styles of supervision, and also the responsibility actually of the master's and doctoral candidate, which I think is really a critical aspect to the journey. So as I said earlier with Prof Anderson, you know, when you work with someone, you have a very different, you get a more in-depth view about them. I think for me, Prof Klopper, as the CEO of Da Vinci Business School, he really has taken the combination between understanding the applied learning side of things and the need for students to really be able to bring business-based problems in the business school context into formalized research. I think it's something that differentiates business schools in general from other university environments in terms of really being able to bring these problems to the fore. So Prof Klopper has held various leadership positions at various institutions, but his passion really sits in research, supervision, and those aspects, and how to build a bridge between organizations and education environments so that we can actually take scholars back into the workplace and really impact through their research. So I think from that perspective, he's certainly someone who has supervised students across public and private institutions as well as internationally, and has also published many textbooks within his own field, but also within the research environment. So I hope you enjoy the engagement, and Prof Klopper, we look forward to you ending this workshop and actually taking us on a different journey from looking at the role of both the supervisor as well as the students. Thanks, Prof Klopper.
Thank you, Dr. Koonin. Much appreciated.
Oh, sorry, I just saw I didn't turn my video on. My apologies for that, sorry.
I'm very glad it's not just me that sometimes make that mistake, but thank you for that, Dr. Koonin. It's appreciate the kind words, but that's enough. I think we're into the session. It is always for me the chicken and the egg, you know, what comes first? Do we talk about the supervision models right up front and that's where we started, or would we talk at the end? And that's what we're doing here today, in a way, trying to summarize that. And my slides is available afterwards. And I want to also thank you for facilitating that session, also to SABSA and the other colleagues. And I see some of them are here early, and for everybody that joined in, because I think this is extremely relevant, extremely important, and in fact, it's a crucial discussion that we need to have with each other. And I really enjoyed the past week. Now, when I look at the topic at hand, and I only prepared 16 slides, and I won't talk to the points in there. I think we can all read that. In terms of context, for me, it's not about the tip of the iceberg. I think about our local context. It's for me the ears of the hippopotamus. And when we look at that, it's not what you see. And I think that's the big challenge that we have in terms of supervision and research in general. Now, I specifically this afternoon want to talk to you about those five.
Prof Klopper, sorry, can I just stop you for a moment? Is anyone else having a few sound issues with Prof Klopper, or is it just me? It's a little bit, it just wasn't clear. It was a bit soft. Is anyone else struggling, or are you all fine with sound? Okay, perfect. Thanks, Jane. Sorry, Harvey, it must just be me.
Thanks, Marla. Thanks, Jane. So the topics this afternoon is to look at those five. Say there are obviously, you have 5 academics in the room and you get 6 different opinions. So there are different approaches and models, and we'll talk about those supervision styles if you would like. Then I also thought it good, considering the discussion we had earlier this week, to talk about, the remestering, then almost, to then say this is how we need to think, and this is how we need to argue around the way we supervise. Now, to get that going, I thought of putting this visual slide together, prominent research, and without giving away my own subject domain, these guys personally have meant a lot to me in terms of their advice in the past. Now, I think they're all scholars, and that's what I also try and believe in, is and say supervision is a scholarly activity. It's not just a process and see how many masters and doctoral students you can supervise and complete and graduate. There's much, much more. So if I look at or think about Joe Hare, him and Barry Babin published the multivariate data analysis, probably the book that's the most widely cited in research. And if I look at Joe Hare, he's at the Mitchell School of Business. He's the PhD program director. He's also a dean of business there. Many, many years of experience. And Joe always talked to me about the concept of unconscious biasness. The lessons he learned to me. And I remember once at the conference, we had dinner one evening together. And he said to me, if you remember one thing, is that of unconscious biasness. Somewhere you have a blind spot. And I think, Charlene, you spoke to us yesterday about the paradigms, how we anchor that. That's definitely, I think, valuable advice. And as a known researcher, he's the first to acknowledge that we must almost find the ways to seek the truth from where we come. And then his colleague, Barry, which is actually his own scholar, his PhD student, Barry Babin, at the Ole Miss Business School, currently the journal editor of the Journal of Business Research, with various research awards. I think in terms of methodology, you always make the point, know your methodology, understand your research methodology. And I think as a supervisor, that's really inspirational. The first time he mentioned that to me and he challenged me, he actually checked on me on later. And, that's where I believe it's important to look at that. So you might think they're statistical or quantitative guys that really understand research methodology. And if you look at Barry's multiple awards for supervising graduate students, the American term, I think it's well received. So there's another pointer from a scholar. Then David Aker, which in my own doctorate played a big role. He's probably the father of modern branding. You always said whenever you engage with the brand, you must look into the mirror. And I think, Benny, you just mentioned that, interesting enough, earlier. And in research supervision, you must always look in the mirror and see, what do I see? What do I hear myself saying when supervising students? And I think that's extremely valuable. And then we have Valerie Zeitrommel in services marketing. That's, I think it was 2016, she got the American Marketing Association Award for the most influential legend in marketing and changing the course of modern marketing. Now, what's important, she also won the Thomson Reuters highly cited research, the world's most influential scientists mind. And I think she always remind me, we're delivering a service. And whenever we speak to Valerie, she'll say, it's a service that you give. You're service orientated. And as a services marketer, it makes good sense. Then the guy at the bottom, Naresh Malhotra, I once asked him, so what makes good supervision? How do I know if I'm a good supervisor? And he said back then to me, if your student, after you supervised him or her, come back and want to publish with you without being asked for the rest of their lives. And I thought about that, and I actually think it was very, very good advice. Now, he also shared with me, as he supervised doctoral students, and he did various, I counted the other day what I know, 9 senior professors that he supervised. On the right-hand side, VK Kumar, one of them, he said to me, the second part that I will never forget, as your students are done and you've got all the examination reports sorted, and you have your first article that you are working to publish, and after you gave all the inputs, and the moment the student wants to publish that, you say, take my name off. Because as a supervisor, your name is associated with the student, and you say to students, you can publish the first article solo, because it's important for your scholarly career to be able to do independent research, and thereafter you must always work collaboratively with others. And that really struck me. I always think about that story. And then his own student, VK Kumar, on the other side, say, you must always look for what you miss when you do research, when you supervise. That's something I always challenge myself. What am I missing? And I ask that to my students regularly. What am I missing? And I think this whole week, the undertone of the discussion is what must be considered. What are we not considering? What are we missing? And I think VK, it's actually a very knowledgeable guy in that space, well-researched, big consultant. So I think that's a valuable scholarly perspective. And then on the last left-hand side, we have Felix Mavonde, a colleague at my former institution. And he always mentioned to me that you must know your stuff, know your theory very well. And I think that's also important as we engage in supervision, to be able to have and hold an academic discussion anchored deeply in theory. Any methodology is flawed if you don't base it on the theoretical constructs. Hence, that's important. And then I was also thinking about Joran Svensson, the editor of the European Business Review, that always say when you engage in research, and he's not that well supervised, but he's well published, he says it's all about the why and the what and the how. And I think by listening to the conversation amongst the scholars, we can get a lot of inspiration, and we can be better in supervising. Now, when we get into that, that's the purpose of the discussion today. And the first question is, what are the best models of supervising? Now, obviously, as we suspect, there's always a traditional model. And to use the previous presentation, I almost think a mode 1 approach, where you have one-on-one meeting, you sit around a table and you tell your student what to do and not to do. It also, with the post-COVID environment, moves into the hybrid space. And I was listening to a discussion the other day where they're talking about virtual reality supervision, where you supervise in the workplace. Now, that's almost like a postdoctoral experience. So I don't think the traditional model is the best model. In fact, I don't think there's a good model. It's probably a combination of all of these. The second one is the collaborative model, where you have a much more focus on the student, and you work together and you almost engage and you immerse yourself in the study. Now, there I can go, mode 2. The whole transdisciplinary reflective, we discussed that, and it's very specific, not so much under guidance, but also the support, whereas the traditional model focused more on guidance and feedback. I say, I tell, whereas this one are a much more subtle function, and you become a lot more than academic supervisor. You also support the student. Collaborative supervision. And then the third one is a collective model. And I experienced this many years ago in the Jönköping International Business School, where students will work independently, but as a group, there's weekly discussions where they share their ideas, they test their ideas, they look at literature together, and the supervisors sit in and they just have discussions almost outside their study where they integrate that to really become scholars of the subject domain. So I'm not propagating here that we do group supervision and group theses and dissertations. That's not what it is. It's the discussions behind that, because that almost changed the pedagogical rationale, and students participate more in the learning experience and you have a better way of learning. Now, when I look at this, what then is the best model and approach? Definitely not number one. It's probably sitting in number two, but with a combination of number three. And that's why I brought in the previous slide where I say it's about that scholarly perspectives. So I don't believe there's a singular supervision model. It depends on the situation, it depends on the topic, it depends on the students, and you must be able to almost adapt yourself within these different spaces. Now, if I have a question, and I'm not going to ask questions into the audience, I just want to ask you to reflect on these three questions, and maybe make a few notes to yourself. And the first one, what are the qualities of a good supervisor or student? Now, the reality is, if you think about a supervisor, you almost tend to fall back in a way that you're being supervised yourself and say, I will do that again, I will not do this. But are we really that well experienced? Have we looked at other ways of supervision, how other colleagues supervise? Do we really engage with them and say, what do you do? How do you go about that? So I think that's a very pertinent question that we need to ask ourselves. And the second one that I think is also important, and it's been surfaced in a few times this week, is what are expected from supervisors and students. And I don't want to say it's managing the expectations, but in the different roles. And, we explained that in the very first session this week, there are very clear roles for both these parties. And we must think about that because it impacts the way we supervise. And then the third one, to really complete the circle, would be to ask ourselves, what are the headaches for supervisors and students? What are the frustrating parts? What are derailing the whole supervision process, breaking down the scholarly activity? Because at the end, it's a scholarly activity to generate new knowledge. And I think in a true mode 3 style, the knowledge generation, what we would say to each other, need to have some public engagement. Hence we have oral proposal defenses and colloquiums on the literature reviews. There's also a reflexivity in that where we acknowledge the limitations and think about that and argue a way around that. And there's also the broader mandate of impact, or may I say the responsibility of the research. What are we researching and how will that make a difference to society? Which is what you'll find in the mode 2, more leaning over to the mode 3 discussion. So with these questions in mind, let's use the rest of the time this afternoon and reflect on that. And, we will get to the questions, but think about that. So what's our feedback? You want to be the yellow umbrella? Are you feeling like the crowd's confused? The discussion we just had on quant-qual versus mixed methodology, action research, integral research, in terms of the research methodological choices. Where are you in the space? How does that impact your supervision? If you don't understand your research methodology, what Barry Babin is saying early on, you lost in supervision. You must be able to guide the student, because sometimes you need to, and you're the soundboard to say, this is not the best method. There's a different way, you're missing that. And then you kind of end up in that centerpiece where you are telling the student, but there's a way of engaging and you must educate. It's a developmental exercise. And I always say to myself, every time a doctoral student are allowed to submit, I'm also worried about the reports, because as a perfectionist, what will they come back with? Have you missed something? So it's almost like a collaborative agreement. And then on the far left, there's always a difference in opinion. And I also think this is important. And a simple example is technical style. Do I force my student to justify the text, or can he left align that? And in terms of supervision, I might prefer this school of thought or these articles or these sources, whereas the student might prefer else. Now, those are good discussions you can have with your student, but at the end, realize there's maybe my way and the highway, or there's three sides to a story. Because a student might end up banging your head against the wall, or you as a supervisor. So when I look at the centerpiece there, you know, you can't put a round square in a square a peg, you know, it's a big challenge. So it leads to frustration. And that's why it's important to think about the different supervision models, the roles, style, but also keep the long-term perspective, the objective in mind. So what are the challenges that students typically face? And here I did some action research and appreciative inquiry, and I spoke to students and I say, tell me, what are frustrating parts? And as they were speaking to me, and it was in general with a group of people that I did over the years, because I always try and understand how did they experience the supervision at our school or at the previous places I work with other colleagues. And I start making notes over these years to basically help myself to not step into that trap. And as I listened to that conversation, I realized this is real. Students experience that, but supervisors have a very, very specific view. And supervisors are basically saying what you will see in front of us, and they're missing the student in that perspective. It's almost like they're not willing to give in. They're not willing to meet the student halfway. And they say, I want to get rid of my student. I want to fire my student. My student is frustrating. The student is not listening to me. I'll tell him or her to do this, not realizing it's not their study. It's not their research. They're merely a soundboard. So I think we must be sensitive to the fact that as supervisors, these are challenges we experience, but it's not our study. We're just another party to the study. And at the end, you must allow that student to grow and develop. Hence the guiding, mentoring is very important in that process. And at that process, by giving away some control, you actually gain more control because you work better with a student. And I know that for me was an interesting observation that I've learned many, many years ago. So I do believe these things are real, but we must acknowledge that. On the other side, the student also have a perspective. And it's very interesting. It's almost the opposite of what we just looked at. And when you look at that, you understand there's quite often a disjoint in communication. And I almost want to go as far and say you should never break the trust relationship between a student and yourself. When you engage in supervision at first as a supervisor, it's almost my view, you must challenge the student, push the boundaries, all of that. We understand that, but the student is not your friend. So it's good to have coffee together, good to talk about the study, but you're not friends. You know, you're there in a professional role. And I saw many times in the past, that's where colleagues start finding it difficult to really guide the students because it's uncomfortable if they're friends. So you must have that distance. And, you know, over the years, I think one developed the ability to maintain that distance while being friendly. Now, I'm not saying once the student graduated, whether it's a master's or doctoral, you know, they should be friends for life. If I listen to Naresh Malhotra, unless, you know, it was really an uncomfortable situation that you supervise. But this is what students are saying, you know, and you know, some of these are bad. You know, if they, for instance, don't trust their supervisor, they have insufficient knowledge. You know, in the past, many occasions, I had to deal with students that came to the office and said to me, they want to fire their supervisor. Yesterday or the day before, I think they asked one of the facilitators, I think it was Professor Pierce, you know, what do you do? Can you submit without the consent of the supervisor? Now, they don't trust the supervisor. That's a real thing. Or my supervisor is unavailable. I reflected my own experience with my supervisor many, many years ago. Hence, I say, if a student submits something to me according to a timeline, I immediately acknowledge that and I give him or her a time frame and say, within the next week, I'll give you feedback. Because I had the terrible experience waiting at one stage 6 months for my supervisor to come back. And he was just saying, we were in a merger. I don't have time. And then it's very frustrating because at the end, we must also remember, and I think it's Charlene that you had that picture up, where for the student that study is everything, and the supervisor, this is one of many other tasks. And we understand that reality, but we must be sensitive, because at the end, you know, the student is doing this process the first time, if it's a master's student. A doctoral, it might be the second time, and the first might not be in a good experience, or they haven't gained the knowledge, where we as supervisors have been down the road many, many times. Hence, I never want to do a second doctorate. But for the student, this is a reality. And we must be very frank about that and never, never, ever forget that. And then we have this paradox, you know, where we almost say, it's the student responsibility. It's her or his study. So I'm not getting involved in that. Now, if I look at the student perspective, the frustration is the supervisor sit back and relax. He or she is teaching and running workshops and don't have time for me. And university actually don't care. They just take my money. So the student carry all the frustration. But what the students sometimes forget is the student study. And the study, you know, it's not something that come easy. You never experience the uphills and the downhills with others. It's a very lonely and soul journey. So yes, the student carry all the responsibility. And I would like to believe in a world of pedagogy where we talk about self-determined and self-directed students versus adult study, where you are told, although you take control of your study, that as a student, you take ownership of that journey. Hence, you decide your own working space. You know, how often do you need to submit? You work on your thesis or dissertation daily. How do you engage? And the more you give in, the better quality you get out of that one. And that's where the supervisor become in a collaborative and a collective role, more for support and guidance than just telling you what to do next. I remember many years ago, I had the students, the first time I met, I always sit with them in the beginning and say, before we approach, after we look at the proposal, before we look at the next chapter, let's just have a conceptual discussion around what should be in the chapter, again, based on your proposal, and throw some ideas back and forth. Now, that saves a lot of the time when you avoid a situation where a student writes a section that are irrelevant, and you would say, I need you to delete those 4 or 5 sections or subheadings because it actually makes no contribution. So talking to the student up front and jointly planning that, it's very valuable. And I think that works. So you actually can work with the student, although it remains the student's responsibility. Then and I had the student that want to come and sit with me and say, tell me what I must do next, and say, that's not how I work. I already have my study. You must now tell me what. And then you change and you actually empower the student in that sense. And I also believe as you give feedback to your student, it's important to not have an immediate discussion. Give the feedback in writing. And, you know, we saw how Rolf and Sean gave us good clearance and guidance on that. And then set a meeting 3 or 4 days later after the student have digested that. Otherwise, you force the student in a situation to say, explain what you've meant here. What about this? If it will work, I do this, where they must actually take ownership. They must almost become independent in their research. And that's the outcome of a doctoral study. That's what we want to get in a master's study, to become independent. Now, in becoming independent, you sometimes need to carry the heavy weight. Hence, this picture, in many ways, for me, is a paradox. So how do you manage the different expectations? And I'm about over midway through the discussion. So when we're managing the expectations, I think my wife always reminds me there's 3 sides to a story: my side, her side, and somewhere in between sits the truth. And I think that's also what I try then and convey in this specific slide. So student expects certain things from university, and it's about managing the expectation, but you must also be clear. At the end, they get access to a supervisor, they get access to the library, they get access to career advancements and processes and workshops and colloquiums. Now they can get that from university. Now, quite often in the past, I've heard students say that was an unpleasant experience with university, but they were absent. They never attended those workshops, they never participated. So if you don't open yourself up to join, you will probably have a negative experience. And it's no surprise that that won't necessarily differ from universities, is how much you make of that. All universities have those resources, they offer that, they're actually similar in that sense. Where the difference comes in is the way the supervisor allow you to challenge your mind and to grow yourself. Now that's where, the second one come in and say, I want to have an expert supervisor. And what students do, they go for the supervisor in their field that's well published, well expert, because they want to be pushed, they want to be guided. Now, in that process, it's the role of the supervisor to bring the student up to their speed and actually say to the student at the end of this process, I supervised you, but in this field, you should know more than what I know about this topic, because I supervised this topic and I supervised another topic, but you went in depth here. So you did all the reading, you actually read more than I on this topic. So you should be the expert. Now, that's where the independency comes in. Now, it's a shift. It don't happen in chapter 1. Normally, the penny drop towards the end of the literature review as you start planning your research instruments. And then it's clear, if we start looking at that expectations, I think these things are actually not that difficult to comprehend. And at the end, we must allow ourselves the whole time or remind ourselves of these different expectations. Now, with that being said, I also don't believe in a soft option. The student has certain responsibilities. So the student must play ball. The student must take ownership. And part of our role as supervisors is to also instill that in the student and say, yes, you must do independent research, but you have a few roles that you need to fulfill. And if you do the following, and I will do that, you will actually develop as an individual, you develop as a researcher, and you will develop as a scholar. And that's what I found very interesting between that relationship between Reshma Holtram and VK Kumar. They really, I think, had a good experience and play their different roles. Now, part of the supervision is not keeping students to the timeline, not be a language editor, is really to challenge them on the content. And, quite often that will mean that you will give them guidance in terms of what to read or how to think about certain phenomena. And by asking questions, you will actually get better answers from them. So instead of talking and telling them, rather ask them the questions and see how they react to that. And, make sure that they're also clear what to do next, because they're still learning. If you keep it too vague and, you're not specific, you will lose the students. You need to guide them. And as they become stronger, going to the gym every day and exercise, they become much more confident and also competent in their way of approaching their own study. But it's a two-way street. The supervisor also has certain responsibilities. And I think here, it's that fine role between the authority and the responsibility. I'm the authority, I supervise, and we heard this week, so many students, I examined so many, you can go and check on my CV or my website, you never should be speaking from that perspective. You would always say, I read an interesting article yesterday. In fact, this morning, I've learned about a new way of a new job description. So we constantly learn about new things. It was a new role. It's a art psychologist. Now, I found that very interesting. Now, the point I'm trying to make, at the end, we're all scholars, and we also learn from the study. At the end of each study, you've learned a little bit about something and you changed your mind. And that's where our realities change. And we had that paradigm discussion earlier this week. So in doing on that one, yes, we all understand that part of supervision, but there are very concrete things, and it's good at front. And I've just made these 6 points that I always follow and say, it's important for a student to understand what's involved in a study, because they want to do a master's or they want to do a doctorate. And in most cases, ask them the question, have you read any doctorate? And they said no. So you must show them and explain to them what a doctoral or master's entail, that they understand the objective that they're trying to obtain. You must agree on certain ground rules. There was a discussion earlier around a memorandum of understanding, MOU, where you agree on certain principles, how you're going to engage with each other. Well, in my previous life, I heard this one ridiculous comment from a supervisor that said to the student, you don't WhatsApp me, you don't phone me, you send me an email. And if I don't answer the email in 2 weeks, then you're allowed to send me a WhatsApp as a reminder to go and check my emails because maybe I missed that. Now, that kind of, it's really ridiculous. I think that's an immature relationship. But at the end, you must have ground rules. I had a student the other day that sent me a chapter a late Friday afternoon and then WhatsApp me and say, I sent the chapter, it was the evening, can we meet on Monday? So unfortunately, we're not meeting on Monday, but the next Monday will work for me. I'm enjoying my weekend. So ground rules are important. You need to understand both have professional lives and commitments and so forth. Most important, I found, is that fourth bullet, to agree on the mutual timelines and deadlines. And I guess I know life happens. Students get busy. It's not my timeline. I stick to my timeline. I put it in a diary. But they all know my arrangement. If for some reason you're not going to make the submission date, reach out to me and we will jointly decide when we move it to, but that will move the whole schedule out. And if the whole schedule moves, you're going to run into timelines at the end unless you're able to catch up. And currently I have a student that missed the submission date and are very eager and anxious, but she moved the dates quite a few times in the past. So I'm not saying it's not my mistake, but at the end, you know, it's also not my study. I can guide and I stick to my 7-day rule. But if the student fall behind, you must also not just leave them there. It's then when you pick up the phone and you check in on them and say, I'm not just your supervisor, I'm also your mentor, I'm also your coach. Now, I'm not your shoulder to come and cry on about what happened at work, but it's a professional relationship, and that's where you start building that trust. It becomes a mutual relationship, and I think for me that's always extremely important. So if I want to summarize the discussion, I think there's a few roles, different hats that the supervisor needs to wear at any given time. And you know, I played between this color red and blue. You know, sometimes you're a director, sometimes you're an advisor, sometimes you're a teacher, sometimes you're a friend, sometimes you're a manager, sometimes you're an examiner. Now, and just on the last point, I also, at a point in my time, we had to undergo supervisor training with our institution in Australia that took 2 years, and you couldn't supervise any students, even at the honors level, if you haven't completed that training. And I had a long supervision record before that. But in one of the work sessions, there was a suggestion that you must not offend the student. And instead of saying to the student, I disagree with you on this matter, you missed the boat, I need you to do this, or this is why I recommend you do it, you must play it in a more vague way and say, if I were your examiner, I would have advised you accordingly. Now, for me, that's rubbish. You know, when you give a student feedback, you do it from a perspective of the examiner to remind yourself, but you should not never hide. It must be always be open, frank, and to the point, and it's the way in which you convey that. So I believe it become a trust relationship. And trust, you know, the other side of trust is commitment. So I'm committed to your study. I live your study. You know, there's nothing more frustrating. And I had it with my supervisor. You send him a chapter, then you ask your question. I say, but explain it in that chapter, and he forgot about that. No, that's frustrating. You must be in the moment. You must live that. But yes, we do have different roles, and a lot of these roles are outside the typical feedback. Now, one of the roles that I never do, I'm not a language or technical editor. And students quite often ask, but you should have told me. I just give a comment once and say, you're mature enough, I trust you for that. Be consistent, and if you pick up again, I say, go and see previous feedback. And I know they irritate students a bit, but that's fine, because at the end, you also need to teach them to be independent and critical, attention to detail, not just in the methodology, not just in the analysis of the theory, but also in the way they write up the final dissertation thesis, because that's ethical, responsible research in many ways. So at the end, you know, I believe in the picture in the bottom. If a person come and they do your master's with you, you know, they walk up straight and they push all the buttons on you. And as they then at a point complete and they go over and they do the doctor with you, it becomes a humbling experience. So for me, doctoral students are actually the most humbling people out there. If you engage with them, you know, they will say they've got so much to learn still. They really enjoy that and they realize their limitations. Now, that's where it gets, but a person that enrolled for an MBA or master's, you know, they arrived and they're doing postgrad, and a lot of them are good, but I've experienced this journey, and I'm not just pointing fingers, you know. I reflect to my own study years. Maybe I was also a bit arrogant at a point, and that I will confess here today. So what are the common challenges that we stuck with when we supervise? Now, we spoke about what's the difference between a master's, short dissertation, and a full master's. You know, how do we do academic writing? We spoke about the responsibility of the supervisor. We spoke about the paradigms, the research methodology, how to write. But if you take all of that together, there's a few common messages or themes that surface, challenges or problems, if you would like. And the reality for a bad experience or bad supervision or being badly supervised is poor planning and management of the research. So we must really understand research methodology and what it entails. A lot of people think it's easy to do research. You send out a survey and out you go. You have a few focus group and there you have it. Not realizing you cannot do that in a month or two. It's a much longer process, you know, and I think as supervisors, we have that responsibility to not remind students because they don't know what they don't know the first time. Also, unrealistic expectations for the research, you know, and I stand to be corrected. I've met many students that said to me, I will finish my doctorate in a year. And then I explained to them, it's a maximum of minimum of 3 years. No, I will do that. And guess what? 5 years later, they're still trying to squash it into 3 years. So it's an unrealistic expectation, not realizing what the study entails, not realizing how much it takes time. Just to look at a reference list, a bibliography, just to read articles, do a proper literature review. You can't write it up in a month unless you cut and paste, but that's really not rigorous at all. So it's our responsibility to show them. And if you show them, they can rise. A big challenge is the third one is the reality, and that's always the worry of poor formulation of your research questions or the hypothesis or propositions, depending on if you follow quantitative. Now, that's where it's valuable to support the proposal, a defense of a proposal, to send the students to conferences, to engage with them, to arrange sessions where you bring in other experts to talk to them about, to give them the opportunity to almost develop their voice, if I can refer to it in that way, to allow them ability to grow. They should not stand in your shadow as a supervisor. So it's important that they start doing that. And the best conversations I have with my students is where we challenge each other on sampling or on research methodology. Now, the moment you have that challenging debate, without being arrogant, you are actually having a rigorous debate and you get comfort that the student is taking ownership of that. And you must guide the student in that space. You know, and I know not all students are equally strong in that one. But that's, I think, a big challenge, because at the end, you don't want to get feedback from an examiner to say your methodology is flawed, your research questions were not addressed. The basic stuff, we all know how that adds up, but this is our responsibility because we're being around the block a few times as supervisors, and for students, it's the first time. Then the writing up, we understand, you know, it's an isolated journey. Students normally in between Christmas and New Year, in weekends, they are working on this, and not everybody appreciate the amount of time that go in. So as an individual, to have that empathy with the student is also extremely important. And then the latter one is the reality. Quite often students also have personal problems, you know. They're being diagnosed with cancer. They're being laid off at work. They're being sent from pillar to post. They got a big assignment, you know, and those things are important to pull your students through. So for me, a good indication of good supervision, if the student can complete the study, maybe not always in the minimum time. And I know some supervisors boost around that, and I see quite often when I sit into performance panels, you know, they say it's a minimum period they complete, but I'm also not naive. What you don't see in that table is a student that would be registered, that never completed. So I'm actually proud if I have a student that come in and win the race after 6 or 7 years as a doctoral student, or after 4 or 5 years as a master's student, because sometimes life happens. COVID derailed a lot of studies. So it's not about how quick you finish, and I'm also not saying, you know, slow start, fast finish, because I understand you can't be forever, but that process of development is what you need to allow the student to go through. And, you know, that's, it's common. So these are some of the realities that I saw in the past. Now, what are important qualities of a supervisor? The second last slide, I'm mindful of the time. I think they're there. You know, these things are not a surprise to us. And as we reflect on them, maybe you go and test yourself and try and give yourself a score. Now, if you're qualitative, you know, interpret that. If you're quantitative, you can work a score out of 1 to 10 or 1 to 5 and see how would you fare as a supervisor. If you were the student being supervised by yourself, would you give yourself a thumb up, or would you say, it doesn't work for me? So when you think about this, the most substantial shortcomings affecting satisfactory progress, now I'm getting back to the progress, is the impact we spoke about the whole week. Here we try and get the process to the end. I think there's a few things. And what for me stand out is this little picture that I put in here. If you look at the bullets, but you know, you almost start, and must say, in a creative environment where you need to have this creative process, you will write. And I know some people say, I write my page today or my alpha page, but what quite often happens after a week, you delete all those pages because people write verbal diarrhea. So you must plan what you write and you must think. So it's not just about how many pages or words you write in a day, it's also how much you read before you write. Because in many ways, you know, it's not just the writing part, it's the knowledge that you gain that sit behind your study. That's important. And hence you must force your students to read. And I always try and challenge them about the academic content. And very often I find myself that I need to go and read about a certain topic because they make a statement and I challenge them and say, this is not understood that, or I don't know enough. So reading that through scholarly activities is extremely valuable for me in this process. And at the end, if you follow these pointers, I think it can be a pleasant experience, and it's a rewarding experience to see the student to graduate. A rewarding experience when a student come back and say, let's publish again, or when a student once a year set up time to have a breakfast or lunch with you, and then it becomes a reciprocal environment, and you'll keep on, because at the end, in this study, it's a meeting of the minds and that little small interface, and that's where you must really say it's a scholarly activity, and it will also push your own boundaries, and it's really rewarding to supervise. Now, with that, I want to stop here and say a lot being said, but we need to allow time for questions, and I haven't monitored the chat. So thank you very much. Back to you, Marla.
Thanks, Prof Klopper. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? I do see quite a few comments coming through, but any specific questions that you'd like to raise to Prof Klopper at all? I don't, Sibangani? Oh, is that clapping? Sorry, I thought your hand was up.
Marla, Dr. Tsako has a hand up.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Tsako.
Thank you. It's more of a comment. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. I think that I've learned a lot, and also I can even locate the problems that I normally come across with during my supervision. Basically, what I always prefer to do before even I start supervising the students is to have a sort of workshop with them, just to understand their capabilities as well as their understanding of what they are about to undertake as their research project. That's where I'm able to know each and everyone's strengths and weaknesses, and that informs the type or the method that I have to use in terms of supervision, whether it's traditional or collaborative model. But what I normally do from that workshop, I used to come up with a timetable that will take us up until the end of the project. But given the strengths and weaknesses, I would undertake the traditional method for those that I believe that they've got a little know-how or no understanding at all in terms of the research, and a collaborative model for those that I believe that they understand it very well. But what I have observed through my supervision is the fact that sometimes as supervisors, you would notice whilst you are in the middle of the project that you should not have taken a specific student probably for supervision due to ethical concerns. And it's not normally the interest of the institution to look at those issues from the supervisor point of view before the student is allocated to you, and to be specific for the institutions that I'm supporting in relation to supervision. Maybe it's something that could be looked at in future. And what I've learned so far is the fact that as supervisors, especially when you realize in the middle of supervision that there are some issues of ethical concerns, is to stick to high levels of professionalism and also stick to the kind of relationship that that you are in terms of your supervision, and be in a position to deal with instances of misconduct or even instances of arrogance by the students. So that have assisted me a lot. Thank you so much.
Very, very true what you've said. So echo that. I say that, Dr. Tako, that's very valid what you've mentioned, and I can only echo that. So thank you for that.
Yes, agreed. I see Simangani and Augustine both have their hands up as well.
Mine is I wanted to ask a question, if it's okay.
Absolutely. That's the forum is definitely now to ask any question.
Okay, thank you so much, Prof. My question perhaps relates to the project management principles in research. Where does it go wrong? Where does we know project management is very important. Those principles and practices, your Gantt chart, your critical path method, and so on. Where does the train go off the rails, especially the issue of expectations? And then my other question is on the guidelines. Most of the time when I supervise my students, I have to pull stuff from A, B, C, D. Until now, is there a specific book that you can recommend as a reference for guiding students in terms of supervision? Otherwise, thank you so much, Prof.
Thank you, Sibangani. So the first question, where do you go wrong in terms of the project management? I think it's about not knowing what you don't know. So quite often students are unrealistic in expectations. They think they can write a literature review in 2 months. Just sit down and write it, or they will tell you they will fix it over the weekend. And you realize it will take long. And I think that's the responsibility then to guide them in terms of the processes, how long it will take. And that's why sitting down and explaining what's expected, agreeing on the roadmap for chapter, the high-level headings, how they're going to approach the topic, how they're going to fit that together. That's very useful. And then keeping them in touch, with that, because students sometimes say, they quickly want to do a qualitative analysis focus group, and they have it all written up in a week, not realizing, the moment you start to analyze that, you start chasing your own tail. So I think it comes down into the unrealistic timelines. They're always overconfident. And that's my big experience in managing that. Hence, you need to have your finger on the pulse. And what works for me is an agreement every 2 weeks. We need to check in on each other. So if you don't give me an update, I'll check in on you, just to see where they are. And that become that thing. And I'm not on a lonely road, I'm there. So that works for me. And I hope that answers you. In terms of the ABC or the 101, there are various books available on how to supervise. What I found, if you go on Google Scholar, there's a few articles. I quoted some of them earlier, more on the methodology. But there's a website, and I'm trying to get it, that I crossed the other day. There's an annual conference on doctoral supervision. And there's also a track on master supervision that I have in Australia among the 8 great universities in the ANSPAC environment. Now, there's interesting topics. Now, they're always methodological of nature. They're in terms of the learning styles, in terms of giving feedback. So there you can find a lot about the, let me say, the pedagogy behind teaching or supervising people. And then if you want to look at the supervision models, there's a lot of mentors and coaches that will guide people in terms of time management and how to go that. So there's a lot of those there. Where I found the lacking part in terms of the guiding is in terms of your theory and methodology. Now, theory is all the databases that we have, the methodologies, all the books on research and the articles that you have. And that's where the coaches and the mentors are kind of laying low, because that's a difficult part. And that's where we as supervisors need to step in. So students can almost self-help them on the other end. But in terms of looking at the theory and looking at the methodology, the research design, the research method, and different approaches, and designing your research instrument, that's where supervision for me become very, very important, because you must guide a student, and there's no quick fix to that. You need to read a lot of research books, you need to know your literature, and you need to read a lot. And you can quickly see if a student are not well versed or confident, and I haven't quoted seminal sources. Now, there's not the answer. I know you find articles, how to analyze a research paper, how to write a good theoretical chapter, but at the end, it for me sits in the two parts where the depth sits. So there's unfortunately no quick fix, and that's where the discussions become important. You and colleagues, roundtable discussions, you bring in some other experts, you bring in other supervisors and say, please join the session, help me and the student think about this matter. And that's a very colloquial approach. So I hope, Simingani, that answers your question.
Thanks so much, Prof. Augustine?
Thank you, Prof Marla. Thank you, Prof, for a wonderful presentation. I think it is very important for me is the timelines with the feedback. And I think when deadlines are approaching or graduations approaching, people tend to become very unreasonable with those timelines and the feedback. They want to violate them and impede on a professional's time. And if you don't conform to their timeline, then sometimes you get a red flag unnecessarily. That is very. I just want to. So I really enjoyed Prof's presentation. I just want to reflect on a particular practice, because I attended master's and doctoral presentations abroad in the Netherlands, and also at the University of London many years ago. And so for me, there's a process where the supervisor work with the student, and the student do sort of in-house faculty presentations to the in-house faculty community. And then there's a capstone event where the student present his proposal to the broader university and academic community. And so the student will go through an iterative in-house process, and then there's a capstone event. Now, at the capstone event, that is where the student present his proposal, and where his proposal will either stand or fall at the capstone event. So it's just that I've attended at a number of South African universities these presentations. And then what I find out is that instead of the student defending the proposal, 60% of the time, the supervisor is defending the proposal. And that constitutes for me, from an ethical perspective, it is not because it is not an in-house colloquium where we are trying to put the proposal together. For me, and that relate to what Prof said about how the candidate must grow from becoming a small tree to a bigger tree. the growth process. So if the student at the broader academic community can't present and defend his proposal, I'm asking myself, is the student ready for the PhD process? When the supervisor is fielding 60% of the questions, which simply shows to me that there was not sufficient grooming, sufficient preparation, sufficient supervisory processes to enable the student to get off the landing pad, because then the student for me is still on the landing pad. So I was just reflecting on that, Prof. Yeah, but thank you for a beautiful presentation. And I just wanted to share with the colleagues that view or that practice that exists. Sometimes I want to say it is intentionally or unintentionally. And sometimes one, out of academic decency, you tend to refrain from addressing the issue because you respect and out of courtesy. But I think this is a proper forum where I can perhaps raise it. Thank you, Prof. I appreciate the presentation.
Thank you very much. And I agree with you. You don't do a student any favor if you take over from them. You need to rather assist them at the back. Make sure that their voice are developed in the process. Now, just look at the different research methodologies for argument's sake. Let's say you're strong in statistics, you understand factor analysis or whatever, and you try and do structural equation modeling, you will be lost the first time.
Yes.
You haven't done as a quantitative analysis research, you haven't done any qualitative research, you will be challenging. So at any given time, there's a new method, there's a new application that all of us are not as qualified and competent and confident in. Hence, that developing the voice. We don't do a student a favor. So those public forums are very useful to allow the students to make mistakes in a safe environment and to refine their ideas and to sharpen their pencils. It's better that way than they get the harsh feedback in the examination process. So it's a developmental exercise always for me.
Thank you, Prof.
Both ways.
Okay, thank you, Prof.
Thanks, Prof. I know, and I know that we technically should take a break, but given that we're into the questions, I'm just going to let us continue with the questions if everyone doesn't mind, and then perhaps we can end off because there are just a couple of more questions, and then we can see if there's any more before we go into the break, if everyone is okay with that. So I think, Prof Klopper, there's a bit of back and forth around, and thank you so much. I can see colleagues are responding to one another based on Monday's session and yours around two areas. So the one being very much connected to if your PhD or your doctoral student is a CEO, and I mean, we see this a lot in business schools, is a CEO, is a director, how to kind of get them on board that in this case, they're not running the show. And we've had many experiences of that. I know you have, Prof Klopper. And then the other one being if students actually ignore your feedback, they don't address it and then continually say, here's the documents, I've made changes, and then they don't address it as well.
Marla, that's the first one is it's a difficult one. I remember a colleague of mine once had the privilege that the student didn't come and see me. He had to go and visit the student. He was a very important businessman in South Africa. But at the end, I think that's where people must realize we're learning again. You must look at the scholarly side of activity. So whether you meet at the student's premises or not, I always try and meet the student halfway and say, sometimes, I want to come and see where you work. Meet me at the coffee shop, or if I'm traveling, let's meet off campus, because it's not about, summoning one person to the other. But I think that touch on your second one, where this individual have a clear-cut way in his mind how he or she wants to unfold the study. And I think that's where you must always base a discussion on theoretical foundation. You cannot just say, I disagree with you. You must disclose to the student why you disagree. It's almost the same way that you will respond to examiner's report. You must acknowledge what's being said, and then you must argue from theory. Now, the moment you start doing that, you can almost diffuse that. But that being said, I also been in a situation where we decide to disagree on a matter. Now, it's not about who's right or wrong. At the end, I've sometimes observed that students are giving into the pressure of timelines and to complete the study. hence, they almost don't have the energy to fight it. And then I'm normally very clear and I say, it's not my study. I will allow you to submit, but on record, I will say to you, this is what I say to you. And, when the feedback from the examiners come, it's a very humbling experience for students, but that's always sad. One should ideally be able to resolve that beforehand. But remember, you become strong voices as the student develops. So at the end, you get people that are product centric and other ones that are service centric, the one that are in favor of this. So it's okay to disagree, because what I also must say, one can never be right. Hindsight is perfect sight. We must be able to, over time, realize I need to change my position because there's new facts that come to the table. So it's not to say I've figured it out 20 years ago and I stick to my guns, But yeah, it do happen that students don't want to receive comments. And those are typically the students that are under pressure, or my view, that are not fully understanding what it entails to do a master's and doctor's degree. I don't really get it in the doctoral level. It's more on the master's level, where a lot of the students struggle. And I think that's what we said in day 1 and 2. It's part of the challenge. But that remains a difficult one. I don't have a clear answer. Maybe some other wisdom in the audience can help us there.
And I do also think there were some comments that were put here around that, it is about the contracting, setting up with the students. What is it that you desire in terms of, what do you hope to get out of this, and how can we basically work towards common goals, etc. So I do think almost treating it like a contract also really does assist in the process, I found, with students of that nature as well. And then the other thing was there were comments, a couple of comments around oral defenses, some comments speaking about that the word itself, implies to fight, to argue, but also about the fact that students often feel unsupported if, for example, supervisors do not come to these things, if there isn't that sense of support. So I do think that as supervisors, it's really important that we do show up for the student throughout the process, and not only during the process, but also at times during the oral defenses, etc. And I think people even commented on the proposal. But the last question, which I lost here, but I saw earlier, sorry, was around that some institutions actually make students get their own supervisors, and the question of ethics around this. And then I do see after that, Prof Klopper, that Dr. Tsako's also got her hand raised. So the first one being just around the ethics of students having to find their own supervisor.
So my view on that one need to look at the proposal. Now, some institutions request students to submit a proposal independently, and then it gets used as a measure for evaluation to be accepted or rejected. Now, quite often they come forward with supervisors. So where I'm always coming from, if there's a suggestion for a supervisor, I want to have this person in the institution for my master's or doctor, because that's why they approach the institution, or they bring somebody from outside. And quite often institutions don't allow to contract that. It's a matter of to determine the distance of is it a friend that you want to bring in here? Because I always say you should never do business with family, and friends should not supervise friends. But if it's somebody that's a subject expert in that space and happen to be known to the student, that's something different than trying to bring my colleague or my friend in. Now, it's not easy. I supervised some academic colleagues in the past, and it's one almost must have that distance. But at the end, it's about the subject expertise. And very often I had to say to a student, there are better supervisors in the space that are more qualified, because students in preparing the proposal want to get guidance somewhere and they start identifying supervisors, but that's an open discussion and I don't find it sensitive to have. So that one is easy to deal with.
Thanks, Javier. And Dr. Tsako?
Okay, thank you, Prof. I think I get what you're saying here. I once came across that situation where I was asked if I have anyone in mind because of the kind of a topic that I was dealing with. That was long ago, but I'm of the view that that practice is still happening. Other than that, I just want to check and maybe to get an advice on how one could address issues of, I would say, dichotomy or contrast between the supervisor and the student who is also a supervisor. How do you advise that one can address probably issues in a very polite and constructive way with the supervisor that is supervising you, maybe for in a second, let's say, PhD project, whilst you are also a supervisor on the other hand, and you know exactly about the principles and everything else, when it comes to issues of concerns and disagreement, how do you then address those issues in a very polite way that won't even dent the relationship between you and the supervisor? I am aware of a student who graduated his PhD in 2018, and it was even written on record that he graduated without a supervisor. It was because of those challenges that he encountered between his supervisor. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tsoko. It was yesterday we spoke about the matter if you submit without reports from your supervisor, but I think this is where we must also be bigger. And that's why I like the different perspectives to being supervised and being supervising, because I'm thinking about, you actually challenged me on this. I had a situation many years ago where the student came in with a specific set of literature. And, as I read that, I asked the student, so what about the rest? I'm missing this part, and in discussing with the student, then we've realized, I asked the question because I was referring back to the initial research objective and trying to keep the student in that frame. And the student already actually moved on, not updating that one. And then when we had that agreement, we then said to each other, so if you update your objectives up front and we refine them, not change them, then this will actually fit. And that's what I said earlier. That's where one needs to argue from the position of your literature, what other scholars are saying. Now, in doing that, we must, as supervisors, say, I don't know everything. Maybe I know a lot about something and I know nothing about other things, but I understand the research process. So it really depends on the situation. If we tend to disagree on a specific way of addressing that, and I can give you an example. Quite often, when I look at, I enjoy the last chapter, the second last chapter of any study, because for me that's where you start seeing how it's being interpreted, and students almost want to put their own little story in there, and a discussion of one colleague that they want to almost filter in without being proper reference, without having that trail of evidence. And that's where you need to explain to each other why you have that specific position. And if you can't find each other there, then something is missing. Now, I'm privileged, I haven't been in a situation where we really had a big clash. I had a student the other day, a while ago, not the other day, who actually said, I'm not prepared to look at your literature review after the 7th version. I think I gave you all my input. I can't take you further because you're just ignoring what I'm saying. And I said to the student, this is not going to fly. And I tell you now, I'm not giving you my endorsement on this literature review. I think it's not rigorous enough. I can't understand your conceptual theory. And the student was very cross. And then a week later contacted me and said she reflected on that. Can I work with her? And but I think that's where honesty comes in. And you must never beat around the bush, because it's important for the student to finish the one advice. So you must say what you need to be said. And I think that's the reality of the academic world. We become so factual driven that we actually don't mind what's being said, but students are not always comfortable with that honesty, and some supervisors dance around the issue. So honesty, transparency work for me, but I can imagine it's possible, and I don't know how to mediate that except being openly transparent about it, and then agree to disagree.
Thanks, Dr. Tsarko's put her hand up, Prof Klopper. Are there any other questions or comments before we close off? I know that we were on the session until 6, but because a couple of people have said they had to leave, due to either transport or other meetings, etc. So are there any questions that I have missed or questions anyone wants to engage with before I hand over to Anne to close off the seminar? You're welcome to ask any questions, anyone else? And I think if all the questions have been asked, I'll hand over to you to say a few closing remarks.
Thank you, Marla, and thank you, HB, for your amazing presentation, and also Benny for session 1 of today. From my side, it's been a remarkable 4 days. We have had a lot of insights from a range of people and faculty, and I really hope that you have all been impacted in some small way on your journey to become better supervisors and external examiners. So from my side, just thank you all for your time and energy. I did post that in the chat. Please look out for all our training programs. I hope it's in order, but I will be sending out newsletters to everybody, and we will add you to our database for future communications, because we do feel that hopefully you are part of our community and we want to keep in touch with you. Marla, thank you so much for your time. You really have held the fort for all of us over the last couple of days, and your energy and insights have really been so appreciated. And without you, I don't think it would have been as engaging and energizing. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Anne.
Yeah. And so just from our side, not to belabor the point, I was on a professional communications course with Jeremy Maggs the other day, and he said, keep it short and sharp, don't overdo it. So from my side, we look forward to seeing you soon. I will process the videos and get the slides, and we'll put those onto the website for you. Hopefully tomorrow or early next week, you'll be able to access those and rejuvenate your thought processes and become better supervisors. I will send out attendance certificates according to who was registered and on the calls, so we will be able to do that for you as well. Just give me a little bit of time, please. And we look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks so much for coming.
Thanks so much, Anne. I see lots of thank yous and appreciation for the seminar and a wonderful 4 days. Thank yous going to all the presenters, and also just in general to SABSA. And I mean, people are commenting words like informative, engaging, uplifting. And I always think of Albert Einstein's quote where he says that intellectual growth commences at birth and it actually ceases only at death. And I think it's an important aspect, because I do think that lifelong learning and continual intellectual growth is really important. And I think on the first day, Sean made the comment when he said, you know, that when you've been supervising for a long time, or like him who's had multiple or a plethora of students, you sometimes forget things. And when newer supervisors come to you and sort of ask them, you are drawn back into reminding yourself of these things. And I think to circle from Monday, that's a really important point. Sorry, Sean was on Tuesday, but that was a really important point, because I do think that no matter where any of us are at our own levels of progression, that our intellectual ability to challenge ourselves, to self-reflect and to continue to grow is never lost, because we can always learn collegially from one another if we're at a similar level or at different levels. So thank you very much to SABSA for flying the flag high, for research and development. I think it is very clear from a lot of the studies that have been conducted by the Council on Higher Education around the importance of uplifting the doctoral and the PhD research. If you look at the paper that was published last year in connection, and it's on the CHE website, very much speaking to the reviews on doctoral programs and what we need to be doing. So I think what you are doing to contribute towards that is really incredible and goes towards that doctoral review process of continual renewal. Thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful evening, a fantastic week ahead. Next week is a short week, so our last long week until the week after, and have a fantastic week further, and look forward to seeing you all again at another SABSA function where we co-create as business schools in Southern Africa.
Cheers, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.